Hello, everyone. We're going to start the public involvement plan in just a moment. My name is Ryan O'Malley. I'm the Ward 4 City Councilor here in Malden. I'll be helping out with the administration of the Zoom attendees. I'm very happy that we actually did do a Zoom option because we have 31 attendees. We have about 2, 4, 6, about 7 people in public here in person. I'm going to hand it over to the team of National Grid who can introduce themselves, but I do thank National Grid for helping organize this, as well as GZA and Mass DEP. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you for your help as well. And everybody at the city who helped organize all this. If you could just make sure, speak into that microphone. Yep. Can folks hear me? Do you want to raise your hand if you can hear me? I can see the chat panelist list. Okay, great. Hands raised. Very good. Hello, my name is Aaron Townsley. I'm a project manager in the Site Investigation and Remediation Group at National Grid. I want to thank everybody who came out for the meeting today, both in person and virtually. With me today are some folks from our team here from National Grid, as well as Dan Cameron, who is our community liaison with the City of Malden. From our environmental consultant, we have our licensed site professional, Charlie Lindbergh, who is the LSP, the licensed site professional for the site from GZA. And then from GZA, we have our project manager, Michael Gray. Just a quick format. We're going to try to do a kind of a quick 30-minute presentation on a high level, and then we're going to open up for Q&A after that. And I believe there is another meeting coming in after us at 7 p.m., so we do kind of have a hard stop so that they can do what they need to do for that meeting. And I apologize, I know it's not natural, but you really have to stand very close to that. Oh, okay, yep, I'll stand right over here then, so I'm not blocking.
Rearrange it however you want, but just stay near the mic.
Okay, very good. First off, I just want to kind of speak to everybody. I think we used kind of default Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection language for the public meeting announcement that they want us to use for these public involvement plans. And I believe that is the same that went out for the Code Red, that same language. I think there was some confusion about the situation. There is no recent release of hazardous materials associated with the site. We are talking about historical impacts from a former manufactured gas plant that operated from the 1850s to the 1950s. It turned coal into gas for things like street lights and home heating. The site itself has been in assessment, investigation, and remediation for many years now. So we're at kind of an interesting juncture, or an unusual juncture for a public involvement plan. But in late March, we received a request for a public involvement plan that was filed to the Mass DEP. As part of that, we need to hold this public meeting, and we're going to draft a public involvement plan for future communications. I think our goal with the presentation is to give you high-level information about the environmental regulations we're complying with, what a public involvement plan is, what a manufactured gas plant is, specifics about this site's history, and then get information on how best to communicate with the community in the future as part of the public involvement plan. And we'll have many more details in the presentation on all that. So I'm going to hand it over to Charlie, who's going to kick off our presentation, and like I said, we'll have quite a bit of Q&A at the end. Thank you.
Thanks, Aaron. I think Aaron did the introductions, but I'm Charlie Lindbergh, the licensed site professional of record for this project.
I'm sorry, Charles, could you please speak into the microphone? Otherwise, no one's going to hear you.
Okay.
You have to be really close.
Here with my colleague, Mike Gray, who is also a licensed site professional. And as Aaron said, the subject of tonight's meeting is the public involvement plan. We'll give you some background on the environmental regulations that govern that plan. We'll also be providing some background on site conditions and the response actions that have been conducted in the past here. And mainly, we're here to present our plan for public involvement and get your comments on that plan. So the Malden manufactured gas plant site, and I will try not to lapse into acronyms and jargon, but my brain's kind of wired that way, so but if I do, I apologize. But site is a large and complex site with a long history of assessment and remediation. And you know, during this presentation, we're going to provide some background on that site, as well as background on the environmental regulations that govern the assessment and remediation. The combination of a large complex site and a complex set of environmental regulations could be a recipe for a real long night, so we're going to present a lot of this information in overview fashion. We'll try to move through the slides briskly, and there will be references if you want to dig deeper into any of the issues, and there will be a question and answer period at the end. And so we request that you, if you could hold your questions until the end of the presentation. The purpose of a public involvement plan is to ensure that the public is informed of and involved in the planning for remedial response actions, obviously to the extent and level that you want to be. And the plan identifies the opportunities for public participation and hopefully identifies the concerns of the community and outlines how we will factor those concerns into our planning for the assessment and cleanup of the site. And I'll walk through quickly the process to date for the public involvement plan. We received a petition signed by 14 residents of Malden on March 22nd. And in accordance with the regs, we responded to that petition and notified the petitioners and Mass DEP that this site would be accepted as a public involvement plan site. So that April 6th response would effectively mark the date it officially became a PIP site. We then established a temporary information repository. The regulations call for a hard copy physical location to store hard copies of certain documents. So we established a temporary repository at Malden Public Library, and we'll welcome your input on whether that becomes the permanent repository. We have been conducting interviews with petitioners and that, you know, to get your concerns, and that work is ongoing. We have prepared the draft PIP. There are copies available here. There will be copies available online. And, you know, obviously we're presenting that tonight. Tonight, which is the designated period for public involvement and document, and we will incorporate those comments into the final plan that will then be distributed. So what's in the plan? As I said previously, there's information on site history and regulatory history, and also some information on previous environmental assessment and remediation conducted. On those two items,
If you could just pause for a second, we have some audio issues going on. Because I've also My apologies. My apologies, everyone. My apologies about this.
I guess freezer.
And while we have some
Thank you for joining us today.
Always great to see you in Malden.
test 1, 2 to those who are in Zoom world. Can you just give us a hand raise if you can hear us again? I think we're through these technical difficulties. There we go.
I'm just going to reintroduce what's going on for anyone that might have tuned in. My name is Ryan O'Malley, a Ward 4 City Councilor. We're here at Malden City Hall, and we're having our first public involvement plan meeting to go over the draft public involvement plan with National Grid. This is related to the historic manufactured gas plant that is located at Malden Center. It's primarily located at Charles and Commercial up to Center Street and Commercial, but the historic site went all the way over to Pearl Street and points south. So this is what this meeting is about, and I'll hand it back over to National Grid. We apologize for the technical difficulties. Thank you. Just figured out the audio, so I think we're going to go back into the presentation and then we're going to get to those questions as soon as possible. Thank you, though. I appreciate that suggestion. And everyone who's in the room, you've signed in physically over here. There's presentations and there are draft plans.
See this deck back up again, and that's what's causing the feedback loop. So this has to absolutely remain muted, and then you're good. So here, so just let me share one more time. Yep.
Sorry for those technical difficulties, and I'll continue on with what was in the plan. We'll try to move briskly so we get to the question and answers. So in addition to site history and regulatory history, we'll present the status of response actions for each of the areas of the site and outline planned future assessment and remedial actions. And the plan will also outline public involvement opportunities relative to those future response actions. The regulatory framework is the Massachusetts Contingency Plan, and it is a fairly complex set of regulations that governs the assessment and cleanup of sites where there's been a release of oil or hazardous materials in Massachusetts. And those are sometimes referred to as disposal sites or waste sites, or more commonly even just sites. But that's what we're talking about. And the Massachusetts Contingency Plan is a privatized system that delegates most of the cleanup responsibilities to what are referred to as licensed site professionals, and these are individuals that have to demonstrate sufficient experience and qualifications, and then pass an exam that's administered by the state to be designated as a licensed site professional. And the responsible parties are required to engage those individuals to direct cleanup operations. The Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection maintains an oversight and audit role in the process. The MCP is, Mass Contingency Plan is considered a risk-based document that allows for cleanup that is consistent with site conditions and potential use and exposures at a site. It doesn't have a hard and fast set of regulatory cleanup goals, for example. It's based on a site-specific risk evaluation. And the goal for closure is to achieve what's known as a condition of no significant risk. And this is actually a quantitative evaluation that factors in a conservative way the constituents of concern at the site and the possible exposures, and actually numerically evaluates those issues to develop an estimate of risk that is then related to the risk criteria that are published in the Massachusetts Contingency Plan. The regulations also incorporate a feasibility evaluation to evaluate possible remedial measures. And that process includes a cost-benefit analysis that is directed at selecting the most feasible option for cleanup. And a common component of cleanups in Massachusetts are deed restrictions that are referred to as activity and use limitations. And they restrict certain future activities and uses at a site. The former Malden manufactured gas plant site is a large site that covers multiple areas, and in some of those areas we have achieved a permanent solution under the regulations, and that basically is a conclusion that we've achieved the relevant cleanup goals, and we're effectively work is complete under the regulations. There are other areas in the site that we're still working on to get to that permanent solution category. And in those areas, we've documented achievement of a temporary solution, which is the next best thing to a permanent solution, and it's a demonstration that sources of any residual contamination have been controlled, and that conditions don't pose a risk currently at the site. But there are several other criteria that have to be met to achieve a permanent solution, and we are working towards permanent solution for all of the areas at the site. The site has been in the system since 1989 and has undergone a substantial amount of assessment and remediation, as you'll see in the overview that's presented in the plan that we distributed. So the designation as a public involvement plan site at this stage is kind of unusual in the process, because more typically that designation comes earlier on in the assessment and remediation process. I'm going to hand the presentation over to Mike Gray, who is the project manager and also a licensed site professional for GCA.
Thanks, Charlie. So I'm going to go over some of the background of the site itself, where we are in the MCP process relative to the work that's been performed at the site. And so this is an old lithograph of the city of Malden. And if you look in the center bottom of the area, there's two cylindrical features that are there. This is from circa 1881. That is actual part of the old manufactured gas plant that was built in around 1855. They started construction of this and was in operation since that time through about the 1950s. So I'm going to talk about the background of the site. So the first thing we're going to talk about is, what is a manufactured gas plant? These plants operated between the 1850s and 1950s roughly. They heated coal and oil to create gas that was then distributed for street lighting, home heating, home cooking, and other uses over that period of time to the 1950s. They became obsolete in the 1950s when natural gas started being piped up to New England from the southwest, and they generated byproducts such as coal tar, which is one of the
main contaminants that we find at the site. And the coal tar was used for commercial uses of asphalt and roofing materials and other things. It's a very thick, viscous material. And other constituents such as semi-volatile organic compounds, metals were usually impurities in the coal, and then cyanide was created through the gas manufacturing process, and again was stripped from the gases that were distributed through purification processes that they had on the plant. So other contaminants that we have are petroleum hydrocarbons, which are benzene, toluene, ethylbenzene, and xylenes. These are very similar to gasoline. Those are the same types of constituents you find with gasoline, and naphthalene, which were all also generated through the gas condensation and the purification processes at the plants. Okay. So our particular site encompasses several city blocks in the city of Malden. It's about 20 acres in total. 7 of those acres are owned by National Grid, and I'll show a plan that kind of shows that. We have several properties that are in the middle of the town that were associated with the site. National Grid owns 3 of those properties, and then all the rest of the properties are privately owned or owned by the city of Malden. This plant was constructed back in the mid-1800s. It was owned by the Malden Melrose Gas Light Company, and then one of the successors to that company, the Mystic Valley Gas Company, operated at the site through the 1970s when predecessors of National Grid started operating on that site, Mass Electric and others. MGP structures and buildings were demolished in the 1970s. A lot of that work was done by the Malden Redevelopment Authority, primarily on sites off the National Grid owned properties. And we started assessment and cleanup in the very late 1980s. And this was actually the first site I ever did any environmental work on in my career in 1989. So I've been involved with this site for a very long period of time. So this plan shows the footprint of the MGP and the MGP structures. And as you can see, it covered a very large swath of downtown Malden. The red buildings were all constructed as part of the plant originally. You can see some of the old water courses, historical water courses that were there for the Malden River and otherwise back in the day. But this plan is just to kind of show you the expanse of this site and this particular plant. It was one of the bigger ones in Massachusetts and operated for a very long period of time. This is a current aerial photo of the area showing the properties that are involved with the Malden MGP site. The bolded properties, 51 Commercial Street, 89 Commercial Street, which are on the west side of Commercial Street, and then the 100 Commercial Street property where National Grid currently resides are all owned by National Grid. The 2 properties, 51 and 89 commercially, are leased to tenants on those properties, and then all the other properties are either privately owned or the Callahan Park and McDonald Stadium portions of the site are owned by the city of Malden.
Would you mind if I just describe the map so people know? So the street going north and south is Commercial Street. The street going east and west in the foreground is Charles Street, correct?
Charles Street. And then the railroad tracks basically divide the Parcel D and the parks on the one side, and then the other portions of Parcel A and Parcel E on the right side of the plan.
Perfect. And in the lower right-hand corner, you'll see the Malden River, which is culverted under the site. Thank you.
Okay. Yeah, those are just the water courses, and both of those discharge the open water area of the Malden River. So this plan shows the status of our response actions. We have some shaded areas there that are shown. The green shaded areas have been permanently closed with permanent solutions. The areas that are in yellow are areas where we've completed substantial remediation on the 100 Commercial Street property or the Parcel E, and also on 129 Commercial Street, which is on the southern end of the property, which is shown as Parcel B. We recently completed remediation on those 2 sites. The other areas that are not shaded are areas where we're still continuing response actions under the temporary solution. And the red line that goes around the properties is our disposal site boundary, which is an MCP term for areas where oil and hazardous material have come to be located relevant to our MGP site. So that is the extent of our, the contamination that we understand to be associated with the property. This is just a plan that kind of shows the explorations that we've done on the property over time. I'm just going to flash through this really quickly to move things along. But we've done a lot of work on this site over the years.
And just really quickly, I saw that it includes the Malden River. How far down the Malden River does the site go?
It's about 1,000 feet from, there's a portion that starts from the discharge point of the culvert, and it's about 1,000 feet.
1,000 feet down to the Malden, okay, thank you.
Yes, as part of our site. So the closed parcels are Parcel D, where Callahan Park and McDonald Stadium are. There's a little portion of that that's still open as part of the temporary solution. National Grid's worked with the city of Malden to do upgrades to those properties. And so that portion is closed. It's not part of this PIP plan. And then also closed with a permanent solution is the Malden River. There was a bunch of work done in the 1990s, the mid-1990s, to clean out the culverts. They excavated sediments out of the culverts. They sealed the culverts. They took care of all discharges from the Malden, from the Parcel E property into the culvert at that time. And they also sealed around the outsides of the culverts to make sure that there wasn't residual impacts that were, migrating along that, along the culvert sides into the river. So they did a bunch of sediment sampling and surface water sampling prior to the closure in 2007. And they concluded that a condition of no significant risk was achieved for that portion of the river, and that no significant risk were for both human and environmental receptors that might come in contact with any of the sediments in the river or surface water. We do culvert inspections once a year just to make sure that there's no additional impacts coming from the site into the culverts, and we haven't identified any issues since they did that sealing work back in the late 1900s or the 1990s. So the 129 Commercial Street site is the southernmost parcel on the site. We just completed remediation there, and we built a system in 2019 and 2020. We operated that system from 2020 till this past March. We achieved all our remedial goals and actually exceeded our remedial goals in that remediation. That site we're going to plan to file a permanent solution statement for in the fall of this year that will permanently close that section of the site as well. And the 100 Commercial Street properties where National Grid has their gas operations, and there's gas regulating facilities on that site. The past remediation work on that site has included all sorts of things: tank removals, soil disposal, coal tar recovery, the culvert cleanup work that was done. There's been a lot of work done on that particular parcel as being one of the main properties. In 21 and 22, we did some additional substantial remediation where we treated some deeper coal tar contaminated soils within an old stream bed that was in the northwestern section of that property. And we did soil stabilization and solidification within that zone of the site. We've also done additional soil removal, which seems to happen every time we open the ground up out there. We usually we dispose of that soil. And then an installation of an engineered cap on the east side of the building. So that work is, pretty much closed a good portion of that site, but we still have some ongoing work where we're recovering some coal tar in the southwestern corner of the property near the corner of Charles and Commercial Street. So these are the future response actions that will be covered under the PIP, and these are the areas that are currently under temporary solution. So for 100 Commercial Street, we still have that coal tar recovery that we're doing. They're doing some upgrades to the property right now, and as part of that work, we're managing soil and groundwater that might be generated as part of that, the reconstruction work that's going on the site. They're changing out utilities, upgrading the buildings and such. Any future RAM plans, which are plans for doing, small-scale remediation work, those would be, if there are additional work that's done on that property, we would have to file a RAM plan to do that. All that would be part of the PIP, and there would be a comment period for those reports. We do annual inspections of the Malden River culvert and the West End Brook culvert, just to make sure, and we continue that on an annual basis, and we'll also be doing that for the engineered cap that was put in recently. And we also do groundwater monitoring around the whole site every 2 years, just to check trends in groundwater concentrations over time. And groundwater is not a huge issue on this property as far as the residual contamination. And we're addressing some of the other sources and stuff on these sites that need to be addressed. Across the street, the 51 through 109 Commercial Street, which is on the western side of Commercial Street in Parcel A, there's a couple properties there where we're also recovering coal tar. We continue some operations on both the 105 to 109 property, and we're currently negotiating with the property owners to try to come up with a plan for achieving a permanent solution on that site. The 65 to 77 Commercial Street has very similar conditions, and we have plans to put in an active remediation system to recover coal tar from that property. And again, if there's any additional work that comes up as we're trying to achieve permanent solutions on these properties, those documents, any RAM plans or Phase 4 type plans, which would be remedial design plans, would be up for PIP comment. And again, the periodic groundwater monitoring, the coal tar gauging and recovery that we do, and any other assessment activities would also be part of the PIP. And just as an aside, we do submit semi-annual reports to Mass DEP in April and October of every year, which summarize the previous 6 months of work that we've done. So those will be made available for review at the public repository for you. And then the general things that we would have for periodic submittals, we have a temporary 5-year periodic review opinion that has to be done once every 5 years for those sites that are in temporary closure. And part of that is to update the risk assessment and to summarize the work that's been done over the previous 5-year period. So we update all the work with additional sampling and other things that we've done, and we submit those. Our next one will be due in March of 2024, and that will also be put up for public review. And if we submit partial permanent solution statements or any other RAM plan type filings anywhere within the site, those would also be up for public review when the time comes. So I know that was a quick summary. The site is much more, involved than what I just did, but I'm going to turn it back over to Charlie to let you know about some of the final PIP plan information.
And just before we go into that, could you go over what it means to be a closed site, and is closed site synonymous with a permanent solution?
Yes. Yes, we're equating closed site with a permanent solution, yes.
But what does that mean? What does that mean?
There actually are a series of requirements that have to be met, and it's a fairly complex series of requirements, but in essence, you have to meet, first of all, the no significant risk standard.
If you could speak into the microphone, I'm sorry.
You have to meet the no significant risk standard, and then you have to demonstrate source and migration control, and there are a few other requirements but it's a specific list of items that have to be addressed to meet permanent solution.
And that's defined by Mass DEP.
Yes, it's defined under the Massachusetts Contingency Plan.
And just so I understand, closed site does not necessarily mean contamination has been completely removed. It just means humans can no longer get in contact with it.
That's correct. In most cases, a closed site does not mean that contamination has been removed. It means that the response actions have proceeded to a point where that no significant risk standard has been achieved.
Okay, thank you.
I think there's just a couple slides left, so it might make sense just to finish that up.
Perfect. I don't want people's eyes to gloss over. I figured that those are some questions I had. I figured we were at a good little break, so please continue. Thank you.
Yeah, and I hear you. I guess the eyes are glossing over, so I'll try to jump through these quickly and talk about the public involvement opportunities and then get to questions. We did establish the information repository, and we have already put a couple of our reports in there at the Malden Public Library, and we will continue to do that. And at certain intervals, we'll be providing notice to petitioners and anybody else that wants to be added to the mailing list that there will be a public comment period on specific documents, and I won't go through them all. But one of the key ones, I guess, would be that permanent or temporary solution statement phase or status, where a document would go out and we would seek public comment on that. And those public comment periods, generally 20 days. Extensions can be granted under some circumstances. And in each case, we would summarize the comments we got and our responses to those comments. And that would be included in a final submittal. So after the comment period for the draft PIP, we would finalize that and submit it to Mass DEP and also distribute that obviously to the information repository, and that would be available online as well. That's one of the main reasons for this meeting, is to seek your comments on that public involvement plan document, and I would request that you send them to me at either hard copy or email at that address. And again, the contact information for myself and Aaron.
And just to kind of translate as much as I possibly can into language that might be a little bit easier to understand, even though I know that we tried our best. The site for locals who understand kind of meets and bounds versus parcel A, et cetera. The site is from Route 60 Commercial Street. It goes down the backside of Canal Street where the Malden River is, goes down to Charles, continues down the Malden River 1,000 feet, goes west on Charles, turns left onto Commercial Street, and the old Panadosi building, that's parcel B, I believe. And it goes down to just past Adams Street. It goes over to the train line. It goes north back up to Charles Street. It goes west on Charles, turns right onto Pearl, where Pizza Pizza is. It includes the parking lot in Callahan Park. It includes part of McDonald's Stadium, cuts over the MBTA Orange Line, goes along the back of the properties on Commercial Street where Idle Hands Brewery is, and it goes back up to Route 60 and includes part of the MBTA train station. Could you clarify what parcel C is? And I notice it's not included in the disposal site, but it's included on the map.
Parcel C was a property that was closed by the current owners back in like the early 1990s, I believe it was, the early 1990s. And they basically had done that prior to the redevelopment and didn't really find anything of note that they were looking for. So it did have some facilities on there at one point in time, but they were propane tanks and other inert type storage.
Perfect. And could you go over the, so for people who don't know, they talked about site use limitations. Those would be like, you can't do certain activities on certain parcels. Could you explain what the activity use limitations are on each of the parcels?
Yeah, an activity and use limitation is a deed restriction, which basically prevents you from doing certain types of developments. And usually it's done to restrict residential development on properties that only meet criteria for either commercial or industrial use. So if you have a site that's commercial and industrial, you clean it up to a certain standard, you would put a deed restriction on it, making sure that nobody could come onto that site and create a residential property from that particular site. And the MCP allows you to do that as part of your filings for your permanent solutions. You put an AUL on a property to just do restrictions. And commonly you would also have other provisions in there for You know, if you're doing any excavation on the property, you'd have to have a health and safety plan, a soil management plan, and that work would have to be overseen by an LSP. So that's on the deed for the site, and anybody doing work on that property would have to comply with that AUL, or activity use limitation.
Probably very obvious, but the reason for those restrictions is strictly health, is that correct?
It's just, yeah, because there's different levels of exposure.
Would you mind repeating the question? Anyone who has questions, if you could just come up and say the questions into the microphone, just so the people on the screen can hear it. Otherwise, we can restate the questions.
Perhaps to be redundant, but just to be clear, that when you say they've changed the deed to be for restricted use, is that the right term? That the reason for that is strictly for health reasons, for safety, for health safety. Is that correct? In other words, we wouldn't also put a community garden there.
Yes, yeah. Those restrictions would all be spelled out within the activity and use limitation as far as whether or not you could do gardening or other applications. You know, and it is based on, you know, the levels of residual contamination usually left on the property and the level of exposure. With a residential property, you have to assume people are there for 24 hours a day, and there's, you know, I don't want to get into the weeds into risk assessment, but there are different standards for residential use versus commercial and industrial use, and it is based on exposure and health concerns.
And I apologize. Oh.
Yeah, you can, you know, the deed can be changed back if you do additional work to limit those, you know, those potential exposures, or you do additional remediation that cleans that site up back to a residential standard. But it's not a requirement for closure for the site.
And I apologize if I wasn't clear in my question. What are the activity and use limitations on each of the parcels?
There's an activity use limitation on parcel D, which is the Callahan Park property, and that was, they capped that site back in 1996, and there was actually a grant of environmental restriction, which is a different type of activity and use limitation, and so it's a little bit more complex, but it was agreed to between Mass Electric, the City of Malden, and the Mass DEP, who all had to sign off on that deed restriction. And that site will be used for recreational purposes in perpetuity unless somebody else comes in there to do some additional work. But right now, it's basically been redeveloped for the purpose of the recreational fields that are on it, and that will stay the same going forward. And we don't, there are no other activity and use limitations currently on the site anywhere that I know of. Oh, yeah, and I think there was an extension of some activity and use limitations that we had on the north side of Callahan Park that were just kind of related to some stuff around the culvert that was found later on when they were doing some of those upgrades back in 2014.
So just so I understand, the only parcel that has an activity and use limitation is parcel D, Callahan Park.
Parcel D, and then two smaller areas that are just north of Callahan Park.
In McDonald's Stadium.
Yeah, right at the southern end of McDonald's Stadium.
We have some questions on the Zoom, and I think that, you know, I heard was it cyanide? That one stuck out to me. There's a question of what hazardous materials were released, and so you did go through it. Could you just give us again a high level of what type of hazardous materials are anywhere in the site?
Yeah, primarily the coal tars are made up of polycyclic aromatic hydrocarbons, which are multi-chain benzene rings. They're very persistent type compounds. They don't break down over time. They're usually related to some type of combustion, and it's just a byproduct of the coal manufacturing process. Those are the main contaminants we find. We do find some lighter end hydrocarbons and those were from the BTEX type compounds, which were really from the purification process and the condensation that was there. Cyanide was generated as part of the coal gas burning process as well, and those were they purified the gas by blowing it through organics that were then, just to purify and get rid of the cyanide. The cyanide would connect to the organics, and there are, I could get into some more specifics about the cyanide, but there are two different types of cyanide. We usually analyze for total cyanides, or physiologically available cyanide is a technique of laboratory analysis that looks at the types of cyanide that might be uptaken by humans if you were looking at a human risk assessment. And we don't find very high levels of physiologically available cyanide on this particular property. But there are byproducts, and you might find lower levels of that type of material in soils or otherwise in the site.
There's a question of what prompted National Grid to work on this remediation. There was a gas leak at the corner of Charles and Commercial by the bridge / the old Panadosi building, where it smelled like gas for several years. Is that what prompted this effort?
No, that is not. This site became an MCP site in the late 80s, and it was based on some original sampling that we had done that triggered the reporting to the Mass DEP.
There was a follow-up question online, and then I'll get to the individuals in the audience, about the activity use limitation, which I think is pretty clear by now, but it was, I assume that the activity and use limitation means that a closed site might not ever be able to be developed for a new use. But as we learned, there's only one parcel, and it's, I believe, owned by the city. Callahan Park, that's owned by the city, or is it leased?
Yes, that is owned by the city, and the McDonald's Stadium parcel is as well.
Thank you. We're going to go over here.
We can also, not ever available for development uses.
Yeah, all these sites can be cleaned up to different standards if it's required to do so to change the things. And developers may come in at some later date and decide that they want to put a residential property on one of these parcels. They would just have to do levels of remediation that would meet those standards to be able to do it. But primarily, this being a very commercial and industrial section of town, these properties will likely stay commercial and industrial going forward.
Thank you. The individual here in the front row in the green, you had a question? No? In the back?
Yeah, shall I come up again? For those of us who are very elemental level of understanding, I want to ask, are there any containments? Are there any containers of pollutions, pipelines included, which carry then a risk factor? Might be fine now. I want to know, are there any containment situations across that property? Is that a clear question? Containers that hold pollutants and are therefore considered secure, but potentially could leak in the future. I just want to know what we're dealing with as far as concentrations of pollutants, whether in pipelines or containers or whatever the definition might be. Thank you.
If there are buried pipes or other things, they're usually encountered during any type of construction. And there are procedures for handling those pipes and dealing with those pipes through cutting and capping and doing other things. But they have to be encountered for there to be certain things done with them. That is something that we're working on right now on the 100 Commercial Street property, where they're running into certain pipes, but some of them are active lines, some are just other water lines and other utilities have been abandoned over time since that site's been in the process for a long period of time, but if it's in a container, it's not necessarily in the environment. So those would be dealt with in some opportunistic way. As you encounter something like that, you would deal with it once if you found that type of contamination, or that type of container in sight. But most of the underground storage tanks that were used on the 100 Commercial Street property were there was gasoline tanks that were removed, fuel oil tanks used for heating, and a lot of the above ground tanks that were there for oil storage or otherwise were also removed back in the 70s or so. Thank you.
Thank you. We have a question from Councilor at Large, Carrie McDonald. And I do want to preface this that we did talk to National Grid about in the future having translation services at these meetings if requested, so that our community can fully participate. The question from Councilor McDonald is, over 97% of Malden is an environmental justice community as defined by our state, due to our demographics and income. How does this influence National Grid's decisions about remediation, since this is an ethical, equity, and justice issue for our community?
Yes, so I think commitment to environmental justice is a core core aspect of what we do at National Grid is doing the right thing, and environmental justice is part of that. We're here to be a good community partner, and it's critical in all we do. I think we seek to clean up sites to regulatory compliance. Where as a utility, we're a highly regulated industry, reporting to the Department of Public Utilities in addition to the communities we work. So it is, environmental justice is a critical piece of what we do, and it is part of what we factor into to how we handle these. And clearly for this site, part of that, a key piece of that will be this public involvement plan moving forward.
Thank you. And while I have you, could you define what in situ stabilization is in layman's terms?
So in situ solidification and stabilization is a process where you use either bucket mixing or augering to mix concrete or another material, bentonite or otherwise, to stabilize material in place. So in that process, you do a test to make sure that once you do the mixing of the concrete and the waste, that you go through tests to look at permeability, look at tests for residual napple that might come out of the concrete, and in most cases it's encapsulation of that waste on site, and essentially that it allows for there being less waste that's in contact with groundwater, in contact with precipitation or other things, so that it just remains as a very large monolith in the ground, in perpetuity.
And just so to do a little bit of a translation, even though that was really good, the gist of it is contamination is dug up out of the ground, mixed with concrete.
It's not dug up, it's mixed in place.
Mixed in place, so.
Yeah, let me clarify just a little bit.
Okay.
Sorry, this is Aaron from National Grid. So in this case specifically, we had a deeper vein of contamination, and if you can picture it, 25 feet below the ground. So what we did was we excavated and removed material above that for off-site disposal. So that went away. Then for the deeper stuff, where it wasn't feasible to excavate all of that out because it was at depths of, again, 26, 27 feet underground, there was a mixing process. And then after that was stabilized down to a depth of, I think, approximately maybe 7 feet, 5 feet, somewhere in that range. Yeah. Clean material was placed on top of that. So just to kind of, in layman's terms, that's what it is. Very deep material that was very difficult to remove safely was stabilized in place, and then clean material was placed on top of that.
And just to clarify, that is the reason why we are having this public involvement plan. When I discovered that contamination was being encapsulated with concrete in the ground, I thought that was a very clear indication that the site was going to remain a contaminated site for a long, long time, because it's very difficult, I would think, to ever remove that now that it's been encapsulated in concrete. And while that might comply with DEP's regulations now, I don't think that it lives up to the expectations of the Malden community. I don't think the Malden community expects contamination to be permanently encapsulated in our downtown.
Yeah, and the process of doing that, and it's a very common process that's used for deeper contamination that it's not very easy to reach down to those levels or excavate. There's groundwater, there's other issues that need to be addressed. It's part of the feasibility studies that we do for these sites to evaluate what's the most feasible thing to do. And in some cases, you're left with doing no action, would be to just leave it in place, and as long as it's not impacting groundwater, it's not migrating anywhere, many companies would just leave that material in place, file the temporary solution, and leave it. The evaluation that we did was that we wanted to control that source. It wasn't possible to dig that deep to get it, so the other process would be to mix it at depth, create that monolith, which basically makes the contamination inert. There's no contact with groundwater. It doesn't leach into groundwater. It's not able to be contacted by people or other, other people who might be exposed to it. It's essentially encapsulated, and it remains in place, and nobody will ever really, come in contact with that.
It's part of construction.
It could be removed if need be, but it's also a very, it's not a typical scenario to do stuff with very deep contamination. A lot of times that stuff is just left alone, but the encapsulation does protect from future exposures on that site.
We have a question here in the front in the green. And also just a reminder, anyone who's online, if you do want to speak, I apologize, you can raise your hand. I do see someone with their hand raised. I will call on you after the in-person speaker.
I have two questions. One is, I'm wondering if any of National Grid's operations right now are producing any kind of pollution at the level of danger that this I realize this is historical pollution, but I'm wondering if National Grid's operations right now, as we're speaking, are producing any kind of problems that we should know about and that need remediation. And I also wonder what all this historical pollution has done has it had any effect on Malden's water supplies? Not just groundwater, but actual water being piped in that we use and drink in our houses. Thank you.
So I'll speak to that first one. No, the site right now is a gas operations facility, and what that means is that's really the folks that go out and do repair on piping, hookups for homes, hookups for businesses, pipe repair in the ground. So there's no gas manufacturing or anything associated with what they're doing now. But there are vehicles and cars there and things like that. So, but that's the nature and extent of what's going on there now. There's no gas production. And then I'll let Mike go to part two.
So the second question was involving the groundwater on the site, and the MCP classifies groundwater in 3 different categories. GW1 groundwater would be considered something that would be a potable source of groundwater for people. Where you have towns that have their own town wells or otherwise. GW2 groundwater is for groundwater within 30 feet of a building, which could off-gas and create indoor air issues from the site. And then GW3 is just any standard groundwater that might discharge to an open surface water body. But the GW1 would be what you'd be worried about if you were drinking this water. But this site does not have any GW1 classification on it, so none of that groundwater is being used for any type of public water supply. There are GW2, so it is qualified as a GW2 because there are buildings on the property, and we evaluate that through doing additional testing of soil vapor and we do the groundwater testing, soil vapor, and indoor air if we're required to do some level of indoor air testing to make sure that there are no exposures relative to that. Did that answer your question okay?
Yeah. I'm just wondering why it took so long since 1989.
Well, this is, and I've been involved with it since 1989, and this is a super complex site. It's not an average site. There's so many other encumbrances as far as, additional third-party owners. There was redevelopment over certain old structures. This thing was, as you saw from that one slide that showed the footprint of the MGP, there was just so many buildings involved and so many areas involved. And we've done a lot of work in that period of time. I know it's been over 30 years, but we recently completed substantial work on it. And you can see from the shaded areas on that plan that, you know, probably 70% of the work is done. And the more difficult properties across the street that are owned by others, we have to negotiate with those property owners to come up with solutions. All these properties are occupied, so there's, you know, tenants in those buildings, and it's just not your average site. It's not your average property. So that's why it's kind of taken so long.
And just we have about 20 or so minutes left. I'm going to get through the questions that we have in here real quick. What are the timelines, and when can timelines be expected for permanent solutions that have not yet been completed? I think you just answered that question. You have to do some negotiation with other property owners.
Yeah, and some of this work could take, you know, additional number of years, but we need to understand too that this site is in temporary closure. So the work that we've done has, you know, evaluated all the potential exposures to people who are on those properties, who work on those properties, who, you know, live near those properties or otherwise. And the risk assessment process is a very conservative process. So you look at soil exposures, you look at, you know, potential, you know, indoor air exposures or other things that they might be exposed to relative to some of the residuals that are in the ground. And we do those risk assessments that are very conservative. And this site is qualified for the temporary closure, which means that there are no risks under the current property uses and activities. So no one's being exposed to anything in those buildings that are, you know, going to be a health risk to them. Yeah, our next major closure is the Parcel B property, which we just finished the remediation on, and that's the southernmost property there. And we will have a partial permanent solution statement filed for that in the fall. And then as we kind of continue on, there will be some other ones as we kind of work through the system.
There just a few more questions here. The question is, obviously, the remediation has been ongoing, and it's still ongoing. You had answered that there hasn't been a recent release of hazardous waste. I think there was maybe some confusion with...
That's what I was trying to get to before. No, there is no recent or new releases. Admittedly, the language we use, particularly around some of this, the Massachusetts DEP language we use, we're like a release abatement measure. It's always a release abatement measure, even if it happens now, because we're talking about that release associated with the historical impact. So no, there is no new release associated with this site.
And there's a question, should we be worried about children using Callahan or McDonald Stadium, exposure to toxins while playing on the fields?
No, Mike can speak to that more if needed, but no, that is not a concern.
So long as they don't dig, right?
Yeah, and similar
No digging.
But similar to the other risk assessments that were performed, there was a risk assessment performed when that site was closed. And they looked at soil exposures. There is a 3-foot clean cap of soil on top of that entire property. So none of the soil at the surface, and the deed restriction for that property says that you cannot disturb, you can't even take a bucket of soil out of that site without having someone being out there and maintaining that cap. So that 3-foot clean cap has to be there, and there would be no other exposures outside of just, you know, either dust or other soil exposures to people playing on those fields.
So are there any public signs that let people know about anything?
The question was, are there any public signs to let the public know about the fact that what's going on?
You know, that there's been encapsulated chemicals on the properties.
Well,
Does the public have any knowledge, like any signs?
I'm just going to...
In case you have little children.
yeah.
I'm going to restate it. The question was, is there any requirement to put up signs letting people know that there has been remediation at the site and that there is contamination in the soil?
No, so there typically is not. So what happens is, you know, the cleanup we do is all part of the public record. Those reports are all available through state resources, and also through the processes we go through as we work through city agencies. I guess moving forward from here for this site, those communications will be part of this public involvement plan, and you know, we want to hear from you on what will be the best ways to communicate that. So kind of looking forward about how we do this in the future, that's what we want those comments in so that we can factor that in on how we craft a public involvement plan for here.
So after this today, we're going to have 20 days to make comments to their draft public involvement plan, but we can request that they extend that to 40 days. I'm requesting that you extend it to 40 days, please, so we have 40 days to provide comment. So please, if you would like to review it, there are some here physically at City Hall. I believe some will be at the library, and we're also going to be posting it online. In the mayor's office, we'll have some. Maria Louise has asked for that. One of the other things is not just understanding what's been done, but also help influencing what happens in the future. Whether or not in situ stabilization will be used in the future, whether or not we're going to require more permanent laypersons, permanent, like actually removing the contaminants in the soil. Those are the types of comments that you can provide, asking that they actually clean up the site and not just cap the contamination. I do have a comment here or a question. As a good community partner, can you talk to National Grid's about National Grid's commitment to providing public access to the Malden River? They have mentioned the Medford Street site, which is not part of this particular location, but this is relevant because the Malden River does go through this site. So the question is there any commitment to providing public access, maybe a pathway, along the Malden River's historic route on the site? Considering it's a closed site, partially.
This is Dan Cameron. I think what we're referring to is the Medford Street site, which does have quite a bit of frontage along the Malden River. And what I can say is that site has a number of Chapter 91 licenses on it, which does require when you either go in for a new application or a minor modification and so forth, that there is a public access requirement. We did meet that requirement at one point, and then we had to go back in before the DEP, and it is public information right now that that whole process has got into litigation, and we've since withdrawn the recent permit, the minor modification that we went in for. So right now there is the original public access, which we did provide as part of the first application, and that was a public area out by the Medford Street end of the property, which was not behind the secured gates and so forth, that people could come into the parking lot, and we were going to create. So more to follow on that, but I think the other point I want to bring up is that that site, particularly the area behind the site, is a major substation for this entire area, and there are some obvious security rules that we have to abide by both at the federal and state level, which really make public access to that area quite difficult. But it is a lot of that information in recent articles in the paper kind of address where that stands right now.
And I appreciate that update. So, but so related to this site, though, would National Grid be willing to? We know that there's some encroachment from abutters. So currently, you don't have site control of the complete parcel at 100 Commercial. And I think that the pivot that I did to this question was, would National Grid be willing to provide some public access along the historic route of the Malden River from Center Street to Charles over the culvert? Or would you be willing to work with the city on that?
I don't want to answer for, but I do want to be conscious of the direction that Karen Stromberg gave us about keeping it to the RTN, so I'm a little bit, sorry, I'm trying to clarify, because Ryan and I had some conversations with the DEP.
If you could just put it, yeah, you can put it on the record, it's okay.
Okay, yeah, so we've been working with the state coordinator, Karen Stromberg, from the Massachusetts Department of Environmental Protection, and one of the directions she gave us was really to keep the meeting and the public involvement plan focused on the site cleanup, if that makes sense, associated with the release tracking number and the historic things. So I just want to be cognizant of that as these questions come up.
So I think that the connection here is public involvement is some degree connected to public access. And there is some gray area about the fact that, so there's the Edgeworth Brook, the West End Brook, and the Malden River and Spot Pond Brook, they meet to form the Malden River on this site. And there's an open channel where the water is, and there is some question about whether or not Chapter 91 applies, and public access could potentially be. I think what we're asking is, since it seems as though you've used in situ stabilization, the contamination is staying in the ground, you've repaved a lot of the area, would there be any willingness to provide some type of public access to weigh against the fact that the site is pretty much unusable from an economic development perspective? Is there any silver lining here?
I think we'd probably just have to take that under advisement and look into it.
Okay.
It's difficult to commit to anything.
So maybe the public, if the public would like something like that in terms of what the future use of the site is and whether there could be any public accommodations, please provide those in your comments. Are there any other questions or comments that people would like to make about the site and where they want to see it going? And yeah, feel free. There's another question. Do we know where the contaminated soil is taken for disposal?
Yeah, that goes to various facilities depending on the nature and the type of the soil. And then I just wanted to make sure we tried to get through some of these chat questions because I've been seeing them. I saw the one here from, we are seeking permanent solutions on all these sites. I said that was one of them that was down there.
Carrie McDonald asks, does National Grid anticipate in situ remediation will result in a further deed use restriction for any part of the site?
So the 100 Commercial Street property, if there was to be a permanent solution filed for that, it would include a deed restriction, and we would have to include that deed restriction relative to the work that was done on there. And National Grid would probably want to control any future exposures on that property going forward. So there will be an activity and use limitation on that property when we reach permanent closure.
The other question is, how is National Grid monitoring environmental issues, including heat island effects, stormwater runoff, and air quality issues related to the current usage as a large expanse of asphalt?
Again, that's kind of one of those questions that falls outside the site cleanup piece. So I just kind of want to make sure I'm keeping it to the appropriate things we're.
How about this? Has there been any looking into using phytoremediation in plants to remediate the site rather than just capping it with asphalt? So using trees and plants to suck up the toxins rather than using, just keeping it in the ground and capping it with asphalt?
Those would usually be done for shallow soil or other types of shallow expressions of contamination, which on a developed property like this, it's essentially all paved and asphalt. It wouldn't be applicable to that. We also don't have high levels of contamination in the shallow soils on this property. We've remediated most of the areas that had any type of shallow contamination. So it wouldn't be applicable to this particular site.
So phytoremediation would only be applicable to shallow site contamination?
Yes, and certain types of contaminants like metals and other things can be uptaken by phyto type processes. Very good.
Any last questions online or in the public? Karen Buck,
I was just wondering
head of the Friends of the Malden River.
Thanks. I was wondering, how far did you dig to find the contaminants? Did you go past the contaminants to find clean soil, or were you mandated to go 25 feet and that was it? I have a couple.
So the process of doing the assessment of these sites, we look at both the vertical and horizontal extent of contamination, and typically that's done doing soil borings or other explorations where we collect soil samples to certain depths, And as we go through that process, we observe the soil samples, we collect samples for analysis, and we screen the soil samples both visually and with instruments to know when we've reached the bottom of the contamination. So yes, when we design the final remediation, it's based on where we have contamination both vertically and horizontally within that zone.
One of the other questions we have here is, when we hear about plans for closure, oh wait, sorry, it's the one below it. What would cause a deed restriction to be needed if a permanent solution was attained? And one of the other, I'm going to cursory answer this. I believe it's to limit liability, but what is that the primary use of a restrictive covenant on a deed? To limit National Grid's liability?
Well, a deed restriction is actually part of the permanent solution for certain closure categories under the MCP. So you can achieve permanent solution either by, removing all the contamination, which for smaller, more confined sites like a UST removal or something, you may be able to get all the contamination out of the ground to where that site is restored to background conditions. On sites like these, that's not typically the case. So if there are residual levels of contamination in the ground, you just want to make sure you control that site so that people just can't, haphazardly dig on the site, move soils from depth that are contaminated to superficial locations, and there's a lot of reasons why you'd want to control those future activities on a site, just so you have it, so you can control the residual contamination that's there, that's not, if you're not able to get every last bit of it out. And that's typically the case.
Oh, and I apologize, I missed this question from earlier. Are there any plans to develop any of these parcels, in particular the area that a baseball stadium was proposed a few years ago? So that would be 100 Commercial Street.
Yeah, it's my understanding the baseball stadium is no longer under consideration. So I don't think there's any plans to redevelop anything into additional ballparks at this time.
And then the last question I have, and I think we need to wrap up soon. A closed site does not necessarily mean that legal liability is completely over. Like there's still a potential for legal action, whether it's Conservation Law Foundation or some other, maybe someone found out they were exposed to these contamination in the past. A closed site just means the public can't get to the contamination. It doesn't waive liability.
I guess, can you repeat the question?
So like, I think that sometimes people might think a closed site means that no liability, it's over, it's done, we don't have to worry about it anymore. But there's still like liability, like legal liability for the site, particularly like if the laws change, if the laws become more restrictive and require more cleanup, a closed site could become not closed.
I guess yes. The closure means you've reached a certain regulatory point in the MCP process, and the reason why the deed restrictions and things like that and additional pieces are there is to make sure that there's a due diligence piece and those things are still understood as the property changes hands or if it changes uses in the future.
Perfect, thank you. I don't see any other questions online. If you do and you want to raise your hand or put it in the chat, feel free to do that now. There's a request that you continue to keep us informed. Thank you for having this public meeting. I want to thank National Grid and the entire team, GZA. Thank you so much for this. We still have to schedule the next public meeting. It won't be as advertised as this, so if you do want to find out about it, please sign in. Please put your email in the chat or send me an email, ro'malley@cityofmalden.org, and I will get you on the list so you receive updates in the mail. Do you do updates via email at all?
I would just suggest please put your preferred communication pathway in your comments, but please put your preferred communication pathway in the comments. We have requirements that we have to meet under Mass DEP rules, and their rules were written in 1991. So we are still kind of working with that, but I think we can figure out something, yes.
Thank you. And then did we answer where was the contaminated soil taken for disposal? Did we answer that question?
Yeah, it goes to regulated disposal facilities in
Okay.
various locations depending on the nature and type of contaminants in that soil.
Thank you. Again, we have 40 days to make public comments on this draft public involvement plan. Please take a look. I know it's super dry in material, but I think it's really important. There are some really cool maps that show the different things. If you like history, I think it would be very interesting from that perspective. Thank you so much for coming tonight. That concludes the first public involvement plan with National Grid. Here, I can.